In January 2013, a small fiberglass fishing boat was drifting across the eastern Pacific Ocean. It carried no functioning engine, no working navigation equipment, and no reliable way to contact the outside world. The vessel was far from the coast of Mexico where its journey had begun, and with each passing day it was being pushed farther into one of the largest stretches of open water on Earth. On board were two fishermen. One was Jose Salvador Alvarenga, an experienced fisherman who had spent years working the waters off Mexico's Pacific coast. The other was a young crewmate named Ezequiel Cordoba. What had started as a routine fishing trip had become a survival crisis. The danger was immediate and uncomplicated. Without power, the boat could not return to shore. Without fresh water, dehydration would arrive long before starvation. The sun would beat down during the day. Storms would arrive without warning. Salt water would damage skin and eyes. Food supplies were limited and rescue was uncertain. At first, there was reason to believe help would come. The men had been in contact with people on shore after encountering severe weather. Their disappearance was known. Search efforts would follow, but the Pacific Ocean is vast. Even a relatively small error in estimating a drifting vessel's position can leave thousands of square miles to search. A boat only a few meters long can disappear between waves. Days passed, then weeks. The two fishermen remained aboard an open vessel that offered little protection from the elements. Every decision became connected to a single objective: staying alive until rescue arrived. What neither man could know was that rescue would not come quickly. Their ordeal was only beginning. Long before he became known around the world for an extraordinary survival story, Jose Salvador Alvarenga lived a life that revolved around the sea. Alvarenga was born in El Salvador. As a young man, he eventually left his home country and settled along the Pacific coast of Mexico. There, in the fishing community of Costa Azul in the state of Chiapas, he found steady work as a fisherman. The occupation was demanding and often dangerous, but offered opportunities that were difficult to find elsewhere. By the time of the events that would bring him international attention, Alvarenga had accumulated years of experience on the water. He was familiar with the local fishing grounds and accustomed to spending long hours offshore. Commercial fishermen in the region regularly ventured into the Pacific in small boats, often returning after a day or two with catches that could be sold in local markets. The work depended heavily on weather conditions. Storms could develop quickly in the eastern Pacific, particularly during certain seasons. Fishermen learned to watch forecasts, read changing skies, and judge when conditions were becoming unsafe. Even so, weather remained one of the greatest risks of the profession. In late 2012, Alvarenga continued to work these routes as he had many times before. The fishing boats used in the area were practical rather than sophisticated. They were built for catching fish, not for surviving extended voyages across the open ocean. Most carried limited supplies because crews expected to return to shore relatively quickly. The trip that would change Alvarenga's life was intended to be routine. For this voyage, he was accompanied by Ezequiel Cordoba, a younger fisherman with far less experience. Reports after the rescue indicated that Cordoba had joined the trip as a replacement after another crew member became unavailable. Nothing about the departure suggested that it would become one of the longest documented survival drifts in modern history. The plan was straightforward. The men would leave the coast, fish offshore, and return with their catch. Their boat carried equipment suitable for commercial fishing and enough provisions for a short journey. No one expected them to remain at sea for more than a brief period. As preparations were completed, the Pacific appeared familiar rather than threatening. For coastal fishermen, departures like this occurred regularly. Boats left harbors before dawn, disappeared beyond the horizon, and returned days later carrying fish and stories from the water. Yet many survival incidents begin in ordinary circumstances. They do not start with dramatic warnings or obvious signs of disaster. Instead, they emerge from routine situations that gradually move beyond human control. When Alvarenga and Cordoba pushed away from the Mexican coast, they entered waters they knew well. Their destination was not some remote corner of the world. It was a fishing ground they expected to leave behind within days. What awaited them instead was a chain of events that would remove every certainty from their lives and carry them far beyond the routes they intended to travel. The Pacific Ocean was about to take control of the journey. In December 2012, Jose Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Cordoba departed from the coast near Costa Azul, Mexico, aboard a small fiberglass fishing boat approximately 7 meters long. Their goal was to catch shark, fish, and other marketable species before returning to shore. Like many fishermen in the region, they expected the trip to last only a short time. The early stages of the voyage were productive. The crew reportedly gathered a substantial catch, filling the boat with fish that would have represented a successful trip under normal circumstances. Then the weather changed. A storm developed over the Pacific and quickly intensified. Strong winds and heavy seas began battering the small vessel. Waves repeatedly struck the boat, making fishing impossible and turning navigation into a struggle. Conditions became increasingly dangerous. The fishermen attempted to return toward shore, but the storm continued to push them farther from land. Visibility deteriorated. Maintaining a course became difficult. The boat was never designed for prolonged exposure to severe ocean conditions. As the situation worsened, Alvarenga managed to contact his employer by radio or telephone. Reports after the rescue indicated that he informed people on shore that the boat was in trouble. He described rough weather and explained that they were unable to return safely. The communication confirmed that the men were alive, but also revealed the seriousness of their predicament. Over the following hours, the storm continued to overwhelm the vessel. Critical equipment began to fail. Navigation systems became unusable. Communication capabilities were eventually lost. Most importantly, the boat's engine stopped functioning. Without an engine, the fishermen no longer controlled their direction of travel. They could drift, they could wait, they could attempt small adjustments using whatever equipment remained aboard, but they could not drive the vessel back toward Mexico. The distinction was crucial. A functioning fishing boat can escape danger by changing course. A disabled boat becomes subject to wind, waves, and currents. Human decision-making is replaced by environmental forces. Search efforts were initiated after contact was lost. Aircraft and boats reportedly looked for the missing fishermen. From shore, there was still hope that they would be found before conditions became fatal. But locating a small vessel in the open Pacific is extraordinarily difficult. The ocean covered the search area in every direction. Waves concealed the boat from view. Currents continued, carrying it farther from the last known position. Even when searchers operate close to a target, spotting a vessel only a few meters long can be challenging. Days passed without success. At sea, Alvarenga and Cordoba watched their chances of immediate rescue diminish. The catch that had filled their boat became less important than the basic requirements of survival. Fresh water, food, shelter, and rescue now mattered more than fishing. The storm eventually weakened, but the danger did not disappear with it. Instead, a new reality emerged. The men found themselves alone on a disabled boat drifting across open ocean. No coastline was visible. No shipping lanes guaranteed contact with other vessels. The Pacific stretched beyond every horizon. The point of no return had arrived. Their situation was no longer a temporary emergency awaiting rapid rescue. It had become a prolonged survival ordeal. From this moment forward, survival would depend not on reaching land, but on adapting to life aboard a drifting boat whose destination was unknown. The currents of the Pacific had taken hold of the vessel, and they would not let go for many months. When the storm finally passed, Jose Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Cordoba faced a reality that few people ever experience. They were alive, but they were alone in the Pacific Ocean with no engine, no navigation, and no clear indication that help was coming. The supplies aboard the boat were never intended to support a long-term survival situation. Any food and drinking water they carried had been packed for a normal fishing trip. Those provisions were consumed quickly. The first challenge was water. Human beings can survive for extended periods with limited food, but dehydration can become fatal within days. Surrounded by ocean water, the fishermen faced a familiar paradox of maritime survival. Water was everywhere, yet none of it was safe to drink. Their survival soon depended on rainfall. Whenever rain clouds appeared, they collected fresh water, using whatever containers were available aboard the vessel. Buckets, bottles, storage compartments, and improvised collection surfaces became essential tools. Rain transformed from an inconvenience into the most valuable event in their lives. Periods of rainfall brought relief. Periods without rain brought uncertainty. Food presented a different challenge. The boat drifted through waters filled with marine life, but catching it consistently required effort and adaptation. The fishermen began relying on techniques that would have seemed extreme under ordinary circumstances. They caught fish by hand. They captured seabirds that landed on the boat. They collected turtles when opportunities arose. Various reports after the rescue described Alvarenga consuming fish, seabirds, jellyfish, and turtle meat during the ordeal. Much of it was eaten raw because there was no reliable way to cook food aboard the vessel. The transition from commercial fisherman to survival hunter happened gradually. Every successful catch represented another day of life. Every missed opportunity carried consequences. As weeks became months, routines emerged. Survival often depends on structure. Even in extreme environments, routine reduces uncertainty and provides a framework for decision-making. Each day involves searching for food, monitoring weather, collecting water whenever possible, and maintaining the boat. The vessel itself became both shelter and prison. It offered protection from immediate drowning, but little else. There was no cabin large enough to provide true comfort. The men remained exposed to sunlight, wind, rain, and salt spray. During clear days, the tropical sun created intense heat. During storms, waves crashed across the boat and soaked everything aboard. Salt became a constant presence. It covered skin, clothing, equipment, and food. Prolonged exposure to salt water can damage skin and create painful sores. The combination of sun, moisture, and limited hygiene produced ongoing physical challenges. The ocean also affected sleep. A drifting boat never remains still. Waves continue moving beneath it day and night. Weather changes without warning. Storms interrupt rest. Survival tasks demand attention. Fatigue became part of everyday life. Despite these difficulties, the men adapted. Adaptation is one of the defining characteristics of long-term survival. Conditions that initially seem unbearable gradually become familiar. People learn which actions conserve energy and which waste it. They develop methods that increase efficiency and reduce risk. Alvarenga's years as a fisherman likely contributed to this process. His experience with marine environments provided practical knowledge about fish behavior, weather patterns, and life at sea. Experience could not eliminate danger, but it improved the odds of responding effectively. Meanwhile, the boat continued drifting westward. Neither fisherman knew exactly where they were. Without functioning navigation equipment, determining position became nearly impossible. They could observe the sun, stars, currents, and weather, but they lacked the tools necessary for accurate navigation. The Pacific concealed their location. Search efforts that might have succeeded during the first days became increasingly unlikely as time passed. The distance between the fishermen and their point of departure continued growing. Weeks turned into months. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation began to emerge. Human beings are social creatures. Extended separation from normal human contact creates significant strain. The two fishermen still had each other, but they no longer had contact with family, employers, rescuers, or anyone capable of helping them. Their world shrank to the dimensions of a small boat. The horizon became a permanent boundary. Occasionally, signs of other life appeared. Birds suggested the presence of feeding grounds. Marine animals surfaced near the vessel. Sometimes distant objects hinted at the possibility of ships. Yet opportunities for rescue remained elusive. The Pacific is enormous, and even active shipping routes occupy only a fraction of its surface. A drifting boat can travel for long periods without encountering another vessel. When storms returned, new challenges followed. Heavy rain could replenish water supplies, but it also brought danger. High winds threatened stability. Large waves increased the risk of injury. Equipment that survived one storm might not survive another. Every weather system required adaptation. Every season introduced new conditions. The fishermen learned to take advantage of favorable circumstances whenever possible. Rainwater was collected immediately. Food sources were utilized whenever available. Energy was conserved during difficult periods. Then another challenge emerged. Survival situations are rarely static. A solution that works one month may fail the next. Resources fluctuate. Physical condition changes. Health problems develop. Periods without rainfall became particularly dangerous. During dry stretches, water reserves diminished. The threat of dehydration returned. Decisions about consumption became increasingly important. Food availability also varied. Fish were not always easy to catch. Birds did not always land on the boat. Turtles appeared unpredictably. Uncertainty became normal. The fishermen lived from opportunity to opportunity. As months passed, the drifting vessel crossed enormous distances. Ocean currents carried it steadily westward across the Pacific. Neither man could know how far they had traveled, only that they remained alive. The survival problem that began with a storm had evolved into something much larger. They were no longer waiting for immediate rescue. They were learning how to exist indefinitely in an environment that offered only the minimum requirements for life. And the ordeal was far from over. As the months continued, survival became less about adaptation and more about endurance. The routines that helped sustain José Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Cordoba could not eliminate the physical and psychological cost of life at sea. The body can adjust to hardship, but prolonged deprivation leaves its mark. Food remained uncertain. Rainfall remained unpredictable. The boat continued drifting through an ocean that seemed endless. One of the most significant developments of the ordeal involved the relationship between the two fishermen and their differing responses to survival conditions. According to accounts given after the rescue, Cordoba struggled with some of the measures required to stay alive. The consumption of raw animals, including seabirds, turtles, and fish, became an essential part of survival. Alvarenga later stated that his younger companion found parts of this adaptation difficult to accept. As conditions worsened, Cordoba's physical state deteriorated. The exact sequence of events cannot be reconstructed with complete certainty. What is known is that months into the ordeal, Cordoba died aboard the drifting vessel. His death transformed the survival situation entirely. Until that point, Alvarenga had shared the burden of isolation with another person. The two men could divide tasks, observe weather together, and maintain some level of human companionship. After Cordoba's death, that disappeared. Alvarenga was alone. The Pacific, already vast and indifferent, became even larger. For many survival experts, prolonged solitude represents one of the greatest challenges a person can face. Isolation affects judgment, motivation, memory, and emotional stability. Days lose their structure. Time becomes difficult to measure. The absence of conversation changes how people experience reality. Yet the ordeal continued. Alvarenga remained aboard the boat as it drifted westward across the ocean. Months passed. At various points during the journey, he reportedly saw ships in the distance. Some appeared close enough to raise hope, but attracting attention from a small, drifting vessel proved difficult. A person can be surprisingly hard to spot on the open sea, especially from the deck of a large ship focused on its own route. Potential rescue opportunities came and went. None resulted in recovery. Meanwhile, long periods without rainfall created recurring crises. Water collection remained dependent on weather. When rain failed to arrive, dehydration once again became a threat. When storms finally returned, they brought both relief and danger. Physical deterioration was inevitable. Exposure to sunlight, limited nutrition, salt water, and constant environmental stress affected Alvarenga's body over time. Yet he continued to catch food when possible and collect water whenever conditions allowed. The passage of time itself became an obstacle. A few days of survival requires determination. A few weeks requires adaptation. Many months require something different entirely. The ability to continue despite uncertainty about whether the ordeal will ever end. By late 2013, Alvarenga had spent nearly a year adrift. There was still no rescue, no reliable indication of land, no confirmation that anyone knew where he was. The Pacific currents continued carrying the boat westward, farther and farther from the Mexican coast where the journey had begun. Against extraordinary odds, he remained alive, but after more than a year at sea, the ordeal was approaching its final stage. In January 2014, after approximately 438 days adrift, the journey that had begun off the coast of Mexico finally approached its end. By this point, Jose Salvador Alvarenga had spent more than 14 months aboard a drifting fishing boat. Ocean currents had carried him thousands of miles across the Pacific. The coast he had departed from was now far beyond the horizon, and far beyond any route he could have imagined. Then, after months of seeing nothing but open water, land appeared. The boat had reached the Marshall Islands, a remote nation scattered across the central Pacific Ocean. Specifically, it approached Eben Atoll, one of the southernmost atolls in the island chain. For a man who had spent more than a year surrounded by water, the sight of land represented something almost forgotten. Local residents soon encountered the survivor who had emerged from the drifting vessel. News of the discovery spread quickly. Initial reports were met with skepticism in some quarters. The duration of the drift seemed extraordinary. Claims of surviving more than a year at sea appeared difficult to believe. Yet as investigators examined the evidence, interviewed Alvarenga, and reconstructed the route of the vessel, the broad outline of the story proved consistent with ocean current models and known facts surrounding his disappearance. Medical examinations revealed a man who had endured a remarkable ordeal. Although weakened by his experience, he had survived one of the longest documented periods of drifting at sea in recorded history. International attention followed. Journalists, researchers, maritime experts, and survival specialists examined the case. Questions were asked about navigation, nutrition, ocean currents, and human endurance. The route from Mexico to the Marshall Islands represented a vast journey across the Pacific, accomplished not through navigation but through drift. The small fishing boat that had vanished into a storm more than a year earlier had finally come to rest. For the first time in 438 days, Jose Salvador Alvarenga was no longer alone at sea. The survival of Jose Salvador Alvarenga remains one of the most remarkable maritime survival stories of the modern era. His ordeal demonstrated both the power of the Pacific Ocean and the adaptability of the human body. A routine fishing trip evolved into a 14-month drift across thousands of miles of open water. The survival methods were often simple: collecting rainwater, catching fish, conserving energy, but maintaining them for 438 days required extraordinary persistence. Not every detail of the journey can be known with certainty. Long survival ordeals leave gaps that cannot always be reconstructed. Yet the central facts remain well documented. A fisherman disappeared off the coast of Mexico. A small boat drifted across the Pacific. One man survived. The story endures not because it presents a triumph over nature, but because it reveals something quieter. Survival is often less about heroics than endurance. It is a repeated decision to continue through uncertainty, discomfort, and isolation. Across one of the largest oceans on Earth, a drifting boat carried that lesson for 438 days before finally reaching land.